it is very clear that the coalition partners will play a very, very big role and probably disproportionate to the, which always happens. So, from the demands on cabinet berths to, what policies or the political projects the BJP itself would have had, I think they will play a very critical role.
But we should not forget a couple of things. One, that our whole reform journey is through coalition governments. 1991 was a minority government and brought about a whole host of, it basically opened up and canned the planned economy approach.
So now that whatever government now, we're actually for the first time in a decade, now we're looking at a toss-up. We won't know what's the kind of formation, the cabinet, which parties are in power even, we'll only find out in the days to come. But just taking off from what Udit said, is that there used to be capitalism with a human face. I remember Manmohan Singh had coined that in his first term, or inclusive growth. Or there were all these words that were used, which in the last, some would say, in fact, some critics would say that in the last 10 years, that nuanced discussion of welfare, economy, you have to grow, of course, but you're still an unequal country, so it has to have a complex welfare architecture. Do you think that inclusive growth conversation is now going to be the modalities of which will have to be worked out by whatever the next government is?
Yeah, it's somehow it's central, right? For a country with this kind of population and with the youth bulge that we have, there has to be some solution. I don't think anybody has a ready solution. I'm not for a moment saying that any one particular party has a solution. But there has to be a discussion on that, and I think to a great extent, the incumbent government was sort of denying a lot of the stress that was there. And I think this is a call from the voters to, at one level, say that, listen, there is genuine distress and needs to be looked at. It's not enough to play on identity issues.
I think this will be forced by the coalition partners now, because now you are a government where you are well short of majority if the trends persist, and if it eventually turns out that the BJP is much less than 272, even if it is 30 seats less than 272, then it is very clear that the coalition partners will play a very, very big role and probably disproportionate to the which always happens. So from the demands on cabinet berths to what policies or the political projects the BJP itself would have had, I think they will play a very critical role. And certainly there are things like where questions were asked, so where where Indian Express also has written about, say, award of projects, say for instance, to one corporate, there may be questions asked by the coalition partners, because I think these are issues which one could probably go ahead and do it because of a single party majority, but not anymore. I think right from to what levels of subsidies to whether there should be a welfare program for a certain percentage of population, whether there should be a cash transfer. I think these things people will play a role.
On this coalition question, not you guys, you're experts, but हम लोग जो थोड़े अनपढ़ type हैं. There's always this thing that governments say, especially single party governments across the board, they say mandate because when it comes to delivering, only a single party government is good at delivering. It's good for economy, single window decision making. There are all these phrases used which basically boil down to give us a very strong mandate because we will make great economic decisions.
Yeah.
Both in terms, say, historically in India, because except for the last 10 years, for the 30 years before that, we had coalition governments.
In one
Actually, Modi government was the only government since economic reforms which had a single party majority,
right? So 30 years of
that was a uniqueness.
So this notion that the coalition government is bad for reform, bad for growth, bad for or at least slows it down. There's too much kick-pit was used to, like that kind.
Yeah.
Is there, does that actually bear out historically and for the future? Is it what's the record of that?
I'm reminded of what Montek Singh Ahluwalia used to say, is that in India, there's a strong consensus for weak reforms. Because basically, we had coalition partners pulling in different directions. Everybody agreed that there should be economic reforms, but when you came to a particular economic reform, people were pulled in different directions. Now, that was true for right through economic liberalization in 1991. But we should not forget a couple of things. One, that our whole reform journey is through coalition governments.
Yeah.
1991 was a minority government and brought about a whole host of, it basically opened up and canned the planned economy approach. So that was the most dramatic shift. And then right through that, we see through governments, we had a dream budget, so-called dream budget in Deve Gowda's government, which P. Chidambaram presented, which cut taxes, individual and custom. So, I mean, it brought about this, because he believed that, lower taxes will bring about greater adherence to tax rates. And we saw under Atal Bihari Vajpayee, we saw a lot of reforms of the kind that increased the productive capacity, brought about new institutions in terms of insurance and, how to manage your money. And again, then with Manmohan Singh, we saw a whole host of reforms. So it's not as if coalition governments do not reform, but yes, the whole process can be very arduous and it can sort of leave a lot of things on the table. In fact, some of the biggest reforms that Mr. Modi has actually brought about, like say Aadhaar or the IBC, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, the GST. These are sort of those things that were left on the table, could not get through because it was a coalition government. But just to put the argument on the other side, Mr. Modi himself has failed to bring about, say, land acquisition, so-called reforms in land acquisition. There was an ordinance early in his first term, which was, there was this whole Soot Boot Ki Sarkar jibe, and it was taken away. In the second term, we've seen the farm laws bit. And then there are also these quirks of the demonetization kind of reforms, which are sort of seen as reforms, which can totally wreck an economy. And our growth rate actually faltered after that happened. So, I mean, it's not a very clear picture one way or the other that one thing absolutely works and the other doesn't.
No, absolutely. I think bang on, because if 1991, as Udit said, it was a minority government. It was not even a full majority coalition government. It was a minority government with support from outside, and it did stellar reforms. But then, you look at UPA 2. UPA 2 was a disaster in terms of, how corrupt it had become, right? One after the other series of scams. And, I know for a fact, because I was so intensely reporting those days, and, allies were holding, Manmohan Singh's government to ransom at that point of time, from disinvestment to everything. The flip side is also a single party majority works in many different ways. So I'm not saying that it's, say, for instance, electoral bonds is an issue where transparency, accountability are huge issues. But then in this government, whatever said and done, we didn't see any huge corruption or scandal in this government in the last 10 years. There was crony capitalism. Of course, we wrote about it, and it says a lot because particularly when there is concentration of power, amongst 2 or 3 people. But then this government also tried to kind of keep the fisc under control, make the most of higher petrol, higher crude prices. So I think it is a mixed bag. Not that one is good or one is bad, but India somehow get a sense that
even the fact that FRBM came under a coalition government, right? So I mean, this government is trying to fit in, and we've written again that they've also diluted certain aspects of FRBM. But the toughest FRBM came during a coalition government, was adhered to till 2007-8 under a coalition government. So I mean, it's a mixed picture. I mean, if you have UPA 2 kind of a situation, obviously it's horrendous.
So then, so the other one for a lot of this thing is everyone gets very worried about markets. Now, all of us with SIPs and this thing. The temporary blip just because exit polls raised expectations, other things were happening over the weekend, or should people panic because of this kind of thing?
My own reading is that, India still needs more bridges, more roads, and India's path is not held ransom to one party or one number. I think on the economic agenda, I think unlike, say, a UK or a US where there can be sharp divides on how you go about, India is at that point in its growth trajectory where there is a fair unanimity of what needs to be done. No matter who's the prime minister or who's ruling, you'll still have to build roads and bridges, and you'll still have to take care of the poor, because there is no magic wand over which you can solve this. So there is a certain unanimity in terms of economic trajectory. How effectively you do it, is the crucial thing. Let's we can see.
Yeah, absolutely.
So no panic selling we should
No
do.
panic. And
Good
I
time to
think,
buy.
Good time to buy, actually.
Good time to
You know,
buy.
such a sharp dip is only temporary. I think, the government gets back to business in a couple of days and markets are back in shape.
So the final thing, one of the big challenges, and I'm going to ask you to give your own challenges and things to do after this, but one of the big ones has been, we keep hearing, I've been reading piece after piece on our pages, which everyone should read, great pages we have in the opinion section. On our pages, we've been reading, I think, at least for a year and a half, that government capital expenditure, first it was centers doing, states is not doing. Now it's center and states are both spending, but that's going to crowd in private investment.
Yeah.
And the finance minister, Sitaraman, had once basically hinted at saying, हमने जितना करना था आप कुछ तो करो. Private industry is just not playing. Your bottom lines are increasing by various measures. Someone say, but that basic putting money back into the economy, generating jobs.
Yeah.
Which seems to be the big pain point, one of the biggest pain points that's come out of this election.
Yeah.
What do you think it will take for the private sector now to start putting in that money, or is it delayed, or are we just expecting too much too quickly?
I think this is a question which try to answer through our news reports all the time, because it is true that certain sectors are doing all right, where investments are coming back on the drawing board, but there are n number of sectors where they are not really seeing that kind of a demand. It could be partly rural distress also, because you look at how the market is split. There is a K-shaped recovery, which is very clear. People may acknowledge it or not acknowledge it, but certain section, post the COVID, which was a shock, it has not been an even growth story in India. And I think certain sectors, unless there is some, so how do you tackle it? So one is to create jobs. How do you create jobs? You need to have manufacturing plus services. There is a question about do we subsidize manufacturing? That is a big question. A government is taking a bold call that okay, I'll give incentives. So there are questions on whether these incentives are going for the right purpose, etc. But in a large economy like ours, services alone cannot create the kind of jobs that this economy needs. So probably manufacturing, but how to do manufacturing? So I think these are.
I personally feel that corporate tax cut, which on paper is a reform, was very badly timed. If you look at the data, our consumption levels were falling. If viewers can recall, in 2019, stories were full in newspapers of cars being not being sold because the demonetization, and after that 3 years, the sharp decline was happening. At that time, this government chose a supply side reform, which is to say we'll incentivize the producers, whereas actually the people were struggling with consumption. So in my view, that was one of the major problems. 5 years have gone and the recovery hasn't happened. So at some point you have to ask the question, well, when do you declare a failure? And as Vaidhi said, the recovery has happened only to the extent that the upper arm of the K. So if certain things are being bought by the rich, that element has seen a recovery. So in fact, instead of putting 150,000 crores tax benefit in the hands of the producers, if that same money was put in the hands of the consumers through tax cuts or direct transfers, it would have actually led to more consumption. And then once there was more consumption, there would have been a business case for producers to increase capacity. So that thing has been held back.
Just so for my own clarity and maybe some of our viewers, so this is like saying your SUV market is growing like crazy. 15 lakh के above गाड़ी लोग खरीद रहे हैं.
Yeah.
अच्छा, but scooty नहीं बिक रही है और cycle नहीं बिक रही है. Those are also, I mean, just as a layman sort of, just for the one.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a K-shaped recovery in that sense. So the top end you're getting.
It was catering to a Khan market.
Yeah. Well,
But not
the political Khan market, the economic
Khan market doesn't have enough votes.
Enough votes in rural India. So I'm going to ask you both now, since this is economy and politics, next government nowadays, we all do this, 100 days, 200 days, whatever. Pick the first thing. What is the thing the next government should do? 1, 2, how many of you want, which is good economics and good politics as a policy intervention?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to answer very quickly because nobody knew what kind of a mandate this would be and how it's going to be read and who's going to herald it. One thing that always works is that you should not make massive changes. So whatever policy is, you maintain that and then tweak it within that. If a new government comes and makes wholesale changes, even within the BJP fold, if they come and make wholesale changes, that puts a lot of doubt in the minds of investors, consumers, everybody. So I think one thing is that don't make such a sudden break from the existing policy that it appears as if uh, anything can change, because it's a coalition government at the end of the day, and things can change again. So
Yeah.
we're going back to that era where not being sure of what lies ahead comes into the picture. So bring in consensus, bring in build consensus, which is something that we saw in farm laws also. Because you did not bring the laws properly, it sort of faced a lot of um, rebellion. So yeah, that.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, because a lot of things the government could have done, it possibly did, and the things which it wanted to do, despite its huge majority, as they pointed out, be it farm,
Yeah.
be it land, it backtracked. So it is impossible for the government to push ahead those reforms, which where it had to very difficult to do that, to build that communication to convince that people. It's a different art. One is that. Second is, but on labor, I think clearly the government can do something, because these labor laws we talked about in 2019, four different labor codes came. Nothing really got implemented. I think, but there is need for jobs. So how do you incentivize
Yeah.
people to set up factories, etc., etc. So probably the government can, in coordination with states, bring some trust into the system and get this going. That was one, and this is already, in paper we have the labor codes. Uh, I think that is something which, and other is, I think, there are certain things for the industry from my point of view. On power, I think,
Yeah.
there's a huge problem today about, baseload power. Thermal has not really, there's a huge renewable jump in our capacity, but thermal has remained unattended to. And in summers like these, etc., there is a problem with power.
I was hoping you would say cutting income tax for salaried people. Thoda budget aana hai. Anyway,
So
so
I think that's a very small percentage.
I know, sir. Since we're in the percentage, and I'm sure a lot of people watching.
ETF to salary income tax, I
There
really
is.
don't
I
want to say.
know. So the final thing, this one of the things that there was a panic during, I would say at least the campaign, this election campaign, when with the Congress manifesto, right? This sort of where the Prime Minister had called Reveries famously a few months ago, and last year I think in that conversation had become a thing. Is that now you made some promises, and those promises are going to cost money, extra, cost the extra. How feasible are we? I mean, if there is, and even if it's, even if it's a NDA coalition government, right? You're going to have. Is there a pressure now that there's fiscal discipline, like you said? We've used up at the space given by petroleum prices. There's been a decent fiscal discipline by the BJP government. It's not gone out of control, at least at the central level. Center plus states might be a little higher. Do you think that that's something that's going to be harder to maintain and require a certain amount of political will? How to go about that?
I feel it's, as I said about, say, the corporate tax cut, you reduce your fiscal space by giving that tax cut. So you have to figure out how to manage your finances. If I remember correctly, Modi years, while we do say that they've done well on the fiscal side, there are two things. A, they've never met the 3% fiscal deficit target, never in 10 years. Two, they've managed to miss it even when oil prices for a considerable period in this 10-year period were fairly low. So it's also about raising revenues. Where do you raise revenues? Again, the choice of your policies. Are you giving tax breaks to those from where you can get the revenue? Are you spending where you need to spend? So I don't think it's necessarily just a matter of saying that you will just add up the expenses and that is a wrecking thing. You will also have to look at your revenue streams and figure out how to improve them. That element is there, yeah.
Yeah, I think, say where a large section of the population gets hurt by marginal increases.
Yeah.
Say, I would typically point out to say GST tax rates, because these are indirect taxes where, irrespective of the income levels, it hurts everyone. So I think that, you need to be very careful. Can we rationalize it better? Can we, give concessions to the to the middle class, lower middle class, and the poor people. So that is something which I would think that government can definitely look at that. Uh, and probably I think there is when there is low growth, typically, if so the growth numbers, what they came, I don't want to get into it, but the growth numbers which have come out now, the difference. If you see the difference between the growth and the gross value added, it's a very significant difference, and people are raising questions. Some people in the market do raise questions on these. Uh, then how do you tackle uh, this huge distress? Whether it requires some support is a valid question for political parties or governments to consider and address. My sense is that.
So the other one was that, before 2014, so NPAs and the twin balance sheet problem was this big thing. We were all talking about government, NDA, BJP then basically inherited this mess. What is the next big challenge of that macroeconomic challenge that should be a priority to resolve?
To my mind, is consumption being down in India. That I think is the thing, and it's down because we have an employment-related stress, right? So whatever jobs are there, first of all, they are not enough, and whatever they are, the jobs are there are not giving you as much income. I think that is the heart of it. From a macro perspective, it's a consumption problem that we are facing. And BJP has tried in the past 5 years this throwing money towards the supply side, and it hasn't worked. Right? It has worked only to the extent to that section which is consuming, and that should teach them or whoever comes next to figure out that you have to look at it differently now and try to solve for that.
Well, I think there are a couple of things like, say for instance, when there is a huge global slowdown, it impacts India. It impacts India, its manufacturing, its jobs, so which happened quite a bit in the past. So when I traveled in, say, Coimbatore, that entire belt, textile, which is that huge, job generating belt, employment levels are down 50%. 50% of people out of jobs, they have gone back home with no idea by the producers of these factories, whether they're going to come back, they need them or not. So, of course, consumption has, and the GDP numbers also show that it is probably at the lowest in the last 8 quarters, if I'm not wrong, Udit.
Okay.
It's so low, so I think that has to be done. But I think investment is something which is required in manufacturing, etc., for job generation.